to Moravian Mornings, the podcast where we explore the lives, history, and culture of the Moravian settlers in Wachovia, North Carolina, and the greater Moravian world. I'm your host, Savannah Franz. Today on Moravian Mornings, we're exploring the interconnected worlds of two seemingly very different groups of people in the backcountry of colonial North Carolina during the war-torn period of the 1750s and 60s. Drawing connections between the pacifist Moravians at Bethabara and the provincial garrison gathered at Fort Dobbs during the French and Indian War and its associated conflicts, we'll gain insight on how colonists negotiated their roles in armed conflict and the evolving relationships with the native nations at the time. Joining us for this week's episode to share his expertise is our friend, Scott Douglas, who at the time of recording was site manager at Fort Dobbs State Historic Site, but has recently taken up the mantle as Director of Education at Old Salem Museums and Gardens. Congrats, Scott. Thanks for joining me, Scott. Welcome to the show.
Hi, how are you?
I'm doing lovely. How are you doing today?
I'm good. I'm at Bethabara, so it's a good day.
It is a good day, exactly. So just to start us off, I'm going to ask you a more personal question.
Okay.
Well, semi-personal. What are your responsibilities as site manager of a state historic site?
So I've been the site manager of Fort Dobbs since 2014, and that job has increased and changed over the years. At all North Carolina historic sites, I mean, our managers are the people that are doing everything from, taking care of budgeting and paying bills and stuff like that, administrative work, HR work with our staff, but we're also put on a lot of different hats. I help regularly give tours and programs along with my interpretive staff. I go out and spread the word about Fort Dobbs, doing podcasts like this one, things like that. I'm an intermediary between our nonprofit support group and the state government itself, kind of the hinge point for all the projects that we have going on.
A man of many hats.
Yes, indeed, yeah.
So, can you tell me a little bit about how you originally got into this world?
I came to history honestly. My grandfather was the manager of a historical museum up in Ontario, where I'm from originally. I've always had an interest in history, different time periods. I was heavily influenced as a child of the 80s by, Ken Burns' Civil War and Glory and all that sort of stuff. We moved to North Carolina in the early 90s, and I attended living history events at historic sites, got involved in reenacting as a hobby, and went to school to do something with history, initially thinking that I would teach. But while I was in university at UNC Greensboro, I worked at historic sites and discovered that was really the method of sharing history that I enjoyed the most.
So you were really simmered in history from a young age.
Yeah, a very low simmer for a long time.
Born into it.
Right, exactly.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for sharing that.
Yeah.
You ready to get into it?
Sure.
So, first things first, can you just give me a rundown of the history of Fort Dobbs itself? Who was it built by and why? And who would have been living in the fort?
Yeah, well, when the French and Indian War breaks out in 1754, the Yadkin River Valley is really more or less the frontier of North Carolina, of this British colony. There are settlers living beyond the Catawba River, out towards where modern-day Lincolnton is, but very small numbers of people. You don't really get larger clusters of settlement until you get to the east side of the Yadkin, where you have places like the brand new community of Bethabara. You have Salisbury, established lower on the Yadkin River. This countryside, when the war starts, it's mostly scattered clusters of farming communities. All of these settlers, like the Moravians themselves, are moving from the north, from Pennsylvania. They're coming down the Great Wagon Road to the Piedmont of North Carolina. But there's a danger that French allied American Indians, especially the Shawnee, people who live in the Ohio country where the war has started, as Virginia is trying to claim that territory, they're launching raids on British colonies, on the frontiers. And even North Carolina, as early as the summer of 1754, sees a few Shawnee incursions. And the danger that that poses is that if large numbers of enemy Indians, as they would have called them, come into this countryside, they can kill a bunch of these scattered colonists. So Governor Dobbs works with the assembly of the colony. He's at the same time looking at defending the coast against the French Navy, but he manages to get just enough money for 50 soldiers to guard all of western North Carolina, and they have the funds to build a fort. And so that fort, which is very originally named after Governor Dobbs himself, it's one of the perks of being a governor, you get stuff named after you. They choose a location that is more or less in the middle of the North Carolina frontier. It's kind of at the same distance to Virginia as it is to South Carolina from modern-day Statesville, which is the location of Fort Dobbs. But we're also kind of east and west where we're on the line of settlement, as close as you can get. Again, there are settlers west of Fort Dobbs, but it's when you get to the east of it that there's larger numbers of people. And so they have to make this calculation, where do you put a fort that will serve the greatest number of people? And they choose where Statesville is now.
What would have been the general military experience of most of these men that were living here, or how did they even go about recruiting these people?
Well, there is no British army in North Carolina when the war starts. Our province, like most British colonies, does have a militia. The militia is a law. It requires all men who are not enslaved, who are 16 to 60 years old, to act as soldiers. They're organized, they're government-regulated sort of home defense units by the county you live in. The theory is with some training, with people providing their own weapons, you can have civilians get organized to defend themselves. The problem with the North Carolina backcountry is that everyone is a new immigrant. None of them have a lot of experience. Many are straight off the boat from German principalities, from Ireland. A lot of people don't own a gun when the war starts. We know in 1755, only about a third of the male population out here across the entire backcountry owns a firearm. So if you don't have British redcoats, those full-time career soldiers, and the militia isn't quite as capable as you want it to be, you need a third type of soldier. And so this province, this colony, raises its own full-time troops. We call those provincials. So these men voluntarily, for the most part, enlist. They enter a contract, a set period of service, but they're serving North Carolina's government directly, not the British Army itself. And it's these men, paid for by North Carolina, armed and equipped by North Carolina as best they can. They are the ones that are building and guarding forts on the borders of our colony, and sometimes even being sent north to Pennsylvania. We see North Carolina provincials fighting in New York during the larger war. But it's 50 of those men who build a 3-story blockhouse fort that they call Fort Dobbs.
That's interesting. So was there a general demographic, perhaps, that this was pulling from other than obviously free white men?
Well, it's a good question. It's one of the questions that we'd still like to know more about. One of the frustrating things about this time period in North Carolina is while the Moravians are keeping immaculate records, nobody else seems to be. and a lot of the records of the colony, things that probably did exist, furthermore have been lost or destroyed over the years. So we actually are kind of at a disadvantage compared to, say, Virginia or South Carolina as far as things like demographic information on the soldiers. All full-time soldiers, they're officers. When they were given money by the colony, they go to more populated areas at the coast and they recruit. They actively try to get men to join their company. At that point, they would have kept a list of all these men's names, of their distinguishing physical attributes, their hair color, stuff like that, what occupation they had, how old they were. We don't have any of that for North Carolina. But if we look at what was common in the time for our sister colonies, we know, and we have a few hints here or there. We know early on, North Carolina, the government tries to mainly enlist men who are vagrants, who don't have a steady career, aren't really contributing necessarily to their local societies. Beyond that, they're really encouraging the enlistment of men who are single, who don't have families, that they're going to miss, that they're going to decide to desert and go back home to. I'm sure as the war progresses, that changes. They end up taking whoever they can get. But that's really the only information we have. Probably most of these guys, they are coming from the Cape Fear region around Wilmington. They're coming from near New Bern, Edenton, our populated coastal areas. If they're like men in other provinces, some may be motivated by patriotism. This is a primarily Protestant colony. You're fighting a war, if you listen to Arthur Dobbs, that is to extinguish the flames of war that have been set by the papist French Catholics on the frontier. That's probably getting some people to join. Beyond that, it's a paycheck. I mean, you're not joining for a career like in the British Army, but for 8 months, a year, 2 years, whatever their enlistment is, these guys have money coming in. And it's probably at least as much money as a day laborer hiring himself out to mow somebody's field in the season is going to earn. You're not going to get rich, but if you're someone that maybe doesn't have a steady trade, it's a good thing to do.
Interesting. Thank you for just giving me a little perspective on that. I'm constantly confronting my own privilege working within Bethabara Moravian history of
right.
Anytime I want to know almost anything, we have memoirs, we have the records of the Moravian people. They write down if they saw a rainbow on a day,
Yeah.
So hearing how other 18th century sites, especially in backcountry areas, how they have to confront primary sources and how that influences their interpretation is always very interesting to me. And we're actually going to get into a little bit more about that later, about how you can use primary sources in your work at Fort Dobbs.
Sure.
Can you paint me a picture of what life at Fort Dobbs may have been like for the average provincial soldier?
Well, that's another thing where we kind of have to look at broader than Fort Dobbs. We look at a more general soldier's experience because we just don't have a lot of the day-to-day records from that specific fort. So we make a lot of interpretive decisions and choices. But there is a lot of documentation for other military posts, for how they're generally run. We have no reason to think Fort Dobbs was any different. So, when the fort is constructed, and it takes the better part of a year from when soldiers first arrive there in 1755 until they have a livable fort. It's not finished until the second half of 1756. So obviously most of that first year, the days are taken up with construction. But even beyond that, every day you're going to have men in a military post that are on guard duty. Depending on the threat level of a time, they may be sending out patrols into the countryside. There are supplies that are being, brought back and forth on wagons. Those wagons probably have escorts of soldiers. Any time of the year, you've got men that are cutting firewood, not just to keep warm, they're cooking like everybody else is over fire, and 50 soldiers go through a lot of firewood. They're probably going to be spending quite a bit of time drilling. These men are not professional soldiers. If they've been in the militia, practicing a couple days a year, they may have a basic idea of how to turn right and turn left and maybe load a gun. But, you want professional soldiers, full-time troops, to have a higher state of discipline, to be able to, react out of muscle memory to orders, and that takes repetition. So you're going to have sergeants leading squads of men, just hours and hours of marching around and loading guns and all that sort of stuff. So there's going to be quite a variety of activity that they would go through just to survive a normal day, beyond the times when they get sent elsewhere on special missions.
So getting into how our two spaces can relate to each other, Fort Dobbs and Bethabara are about 50 miles away from each other, which is both not a lot and yet also a solid amount of space when you don't have a car.
Right.
What was the relationship between these provincial forces in this religious pacifist trades town? They obviously were within range of each other and had relationship with each other, at least according to the Moravian records. But can you just perhaps speak on that a little bit more?
Yeah, well, and talking earlier about, records, we rely on the Moravians for some of the instances, references to our soldiers. There are several times when they're directly communicating. In 1756, some Moravians are in Salisbury. They meet Captain Hugh Waddell, who was the initial commander of Fort Dobbs. He's an Irish immigrant, like the governor himself. He was about 22 or 23 in that year when the fort was completed. And they get a favorable impression of him. The governor himself talks about him being a very reliable young man. We think he's looking to make his way in the world. He's taking his job very seriously. And during the war, there's probably lots of times that soldiers are getting supplies from here, passing through, that we don't necessarily have direct written reference to. But we know of several occasions, especially in 1759 and 1760, as there's active warfare in the region, that patrols of soldiers are entering Bethabara as they're protecting the Yadkin River Valley. We know in 1761, a regiment of 400 North Carolina Provincials is here at Bethabara on their way north to fight in Virginia. They actually end up court-martialing some men between here and Bethania, as a matter of fact. Some guys don't want to leave North Carolina, and they get whipped into submission for doing that. But yeah, on their way home, they're passing back through here. So there's a lot of that. There's some instances of that direct communication. We also know later in the war in 1760, Fort Dobbs sends a supply of gunpowder to Bethabara for the Moravians, who have established their own militia for their own personal defense. They're walking a weird line where they don't want to have to attack anybody. So they get special permission from the governor to have a defensive militia. But Fort Dobbs gives them gunpowder. We know when the war is over, not to spoil the ending, but the French lose and the frontier moves west. And Fort Dobbs eventually is closed. We know as it's kind of declining, as it's just a storage facility, at one point, although we don't know all the circumstances around it, 1,000 pounds of lead that was at the fort is sent to Bethabara. And in exchange, the fort's caretaker, a former officer named Walter Lindsay, gets a wagon load of pottery from Gottfried Aust. We don't know anything more about that. That's not an official, I don't think that's an official government transaction, actually. I have a feeling that he's like, let's get rid of some of this lead. No one's going to notice it. And then I can sell that redware out here. But during the war, we do have lots of interactions, yeah.
It's just so fascinating to me that this strange relationship of both being fortified areas within 50 miles of each other, but coming from very different perspectives of obviously a pacifist town, but also they might be pacifists, but they certainly do believe in their own self-defense. I can't help but think of the personal interactions, perhaps, of these provincial soldiers giving over weaponry or different sorts of supplies to these people that are philosophically perhaps different than them.
Yeah, sure. I mean, they certainly have different motivations, but the Moravians, they're 100% not above defending themselves. I mean, the fort that's here at Bethabara is built relatively, well, just a year after, well, it started the same year that Fort Dobbs is completed, because of the threat of these French allies coming out of the north. They've heard about all the attacks on the New River Valley up in southwestern Virginia by refugees that are fleeing that region, that are coming down here, and they're bringing those stories of violence. And the Moravians have to confront that. How do you, maintain your pacifist stance, your love for your fellow Christian man or your fellow human in general, but also not get killed. So they're building a fort here, and Captain Lurch leads that company of militia. These guys, they're training, and they are armed. But again, they get that special permission to not, like the soldiers, they don't have to go after anybody. They don't have to go attack anybody. But they're very prepared to defend themselves. Now, it helps having, a company of provincial soldiers in 1759 and 60, having other people whose job it is to go seek out the enemy and kill them that are nearby, that are on the river. That probably helps Bethabara defend itself.
Speaking more on specific instances, in the records of the Moravian people in North Carolina, the Bethabara Diarist notes a visit from one Captain Bagley in 1760. Mm-hmm. Why might he and his soldiers come to Bethabara at that time?
Well, so Captain Bagley is never here, but Captain Bailey actually is. So Andrew Bailey was another Irish officer who was living in North Carolina. That poor guy, his name gets spelled 50 different ways in the different sources. Even English sources are spelling his name oddly. The Moravians choose to spell it Bagley for some reason, but we're pretty sure it's the same guy. But he starts the war actually as the second in command at Fort Dobbs, but he spends most of his career out here on the frontier. Although he, like Hugh Waddell, had gone all the way to Pennsylvania in 1758. But when the later stage of the French and Indian War involves fighting with the Cherokee here in western North Carolina, and Bailey, both in 1759, when Cherokee attacks begin in this area that April and May, as well as in 1760, there are times that he's in charge of one company of men that are patrolling from the forks of the Yadkin River, kind of just north of Salisbury, up to the Virginia line. And so they're passing through Bethabara in this region very frequently. That's while other soldiers are at Fort Dobbs beyond the Yadkin River. So he's got a lot of contact with the town. And we don't know actually if it's his men specifically, but I mean, there's some wounded soldiers that are brought in here at one point. We don't have the source from Bailey's side. We don't have a piece of paper recording a specific skirmish. But again, those Moravian records give us a hint that something had happened. There's a guy buried in the Strangers Graveyard here who was a soldier who died. A man who was at least originally from Virginia. So, that's very likely connected to Bailey's men passing through here.
Excellent. So, great lead-in. Can we talk more about what is the Anglo-Cherokee War? What are its causes, and how did it come out of the French and Indian War that's part of the greater narrative?
Well, so the French and Indian War is, it's something that turns into a global conflict. It's known as the 7 Years' War elsewhere in the world. It's really a bunch of wars under one umbrella. That all are related to each other. They get started because the British and the French are fighting, but in some ways they're their own conflicts, and the Anglo-Cherokee War is a really good example of that. So we talked about Bethabara being fortified and Fort Dobbs being built to defend this part of the frontier. That's not because of the native people that live closest, which is the Cherokee, who are in the mountains of North Carolina, and the Catawba, who live near present-day Charlotte still today, those nations are British allies. The Cherokee have, apart from one brief instance in the Yamasee War, they've been allies of the British for about 40 years. By this point, they are trading partners. A lot of the deer hides that are coming into Bethabara here, being exchanged for goods in the store and tavern by white hunters, there's also a huge deerskin trade by Cherokee hunters in particular, especially going through South Carolina's seaports. And they're relying on the British for manufactured goods, for tools, for clothing. It's a very tight-knit relationship by this point. The Cherokee are on the British side of the French and Indian War. They are actively fighting the French. They are actively fighting other American Indian nations like the Shawnee, who were French allies, but also happened to off and on be a people that went to war with the Cherokee. So it kind of worked out for their own political goals in that sense. In 1758, we talked about North Carolina soldiers going to Pennsylvania. There are almost 600 Cherokee who also make that journey to help the British Army. Most of those men pass through Bethabara. In fact, one of them later relates, in talking to the Moravians in peacetime, that they referred to Bethabara as the Dutch fort where there are, good people and much bread,
Yep.
I think it is. So, which is the best thing you can say about Bethabara still.
Truly.
So they're these friends. Now, they're people from a very different culture. And they're encountering, the settlers here on the frontier of North Carolina and Virginia are not all people that are used to living in close proximity to these people who speak an entirely different language, who are, have very different cultural norms. And there start to be instances of mistrust and cases where, are Indians trying to rob people? One of the Moravian brethren I know, and I think as early as 1756, gets stopped on the road near Bethabara by a party of Cherokee who say that he should get off his horse so that they can take it. And he refuses. He ends up convincing them to come to my house, I'll feed you instead. They're not necessarily stealing his horse. They need it for some reason, but they have a different idea of personal property. But if instances like that can lead to violence pretty easily, and in some cases in the Carolinas and in Virginia, they do. In 1758, many of those Cherokee passing back and forth from the Carolinas to Pennsylvania encounter Virginia militia. And the Virginians have been under heavy, constant attack by people like the Shawnee. And in some cases, they mistake Cherokee parties for enemies. In other cases, we actually know that there are militiamen who know who they're dealing with, but they're scared of any Indian. And the fact that they might be enemy Indians is a good cover. In any case, in all these different instances put together, we see about 40 Cherokee murdered in 1758, primarily by Virginians, but also a few people in North and South Carolina. The families of those Cherokee need some sort of resolution. They apply through diplomatic channels, especially working through South Carolina's governor, but the result of several months of effort is no justice. No one ever pays a price for these deaths. And in their culture at the time, like many Eastern woodland Native American cultures, the way to deal with murder might be to kill the murderer or to kill someone from that person's nation. It sort of restores a balance, makes everything even again. And so really with no other recourse, in April of 1759, the Cherokee as a people don't do this, but affected families who have lost loved ones, who need to put their grief to an end, who need to make up for that hole in their family, in their town, in their society, they kill the same number of British people. But the majority of those attacks, those revenge killings, occur in North Carolina, just because geographically we're closer to a lot of those towns in the North Carolina mountains. To the Cherokee, this is fine, right? We've taken a life for a life. We're still friends. But of course, the people that are killed in the North Carolina Piedmont are also generally innocent people. Their families want revenge. They want their governments to do something about it. And we can get into more details if you want, but the long story short is that we see these allies go to war with each other. So the Anglo-Cherokee War it comes out of the circumstances of the French and Indian War, but the Cherokee are not French allies. They just start fighting their friends, the British. So it's kind of its own little war, its own individual war that begins.
For the Moravians, at least at Bethabara, their relationship with the Cherokee was always kind of constantly evolving, from like respectful trade and sheltering of like passing soldiers to obviously a genuine fear of attack fueled by the changing tides of war, and of course then the influx of refugees to their area, fueling that fear and like the reality of what is actually happening in the North Carolina backcountry. But did the garrison at Fort Dobbs face changes in their relationship throughout the French and Indian War into the Anglo-Cherokee War as well?
Well, very much the same as the Moravians. Yeah, I mean, Fort Dobbs isn't... it's not close enough to the Cherokee or the Catawba towns that it's not a place where they are negotiating government treaties or anything like that. But like Bethabara, it's on some of the road network through this area. And yeah, as allies, we see several occasions where Cherokee are passing through and stop at Fort Dobbs. In 1757, we have a couple of instances. At one point, as many as 200 Cherokee stopped there. And they're doing it either as they're going to war further north, or as they're going to or from meeting with colonial officials up in Virginia or Maryland. And Fort Dobbs is kind of a waypoint for them. They can stop there. We know that men like Captain Waddell he's probably giving them supplies, what goods he can. We know that he sends some of his soldiers to escort these different Cherokee parties between Fort Dobbs and their mountain homes. Partially to head off this potential trouble, right? It's protection for the Cherokee themselves from any settlers who might get scared. It can reassure those settlers as well. It's going to make sure that people on neither side, the Cherokee or settlers, are going to misunderstand each other because they have an escort of soldiers. These guys are okay. We can take them home.
They spend this money and this time on building this fort and training these men, but did any conflict actually reach Fort Dobbs during the French and Indian War in the Anglo-Cherokee War?
Well, it certainly does. Like Bethabara, though, the irony of Fort Dobbs' history is it is built because of the danger of Shawnee attacks. It is actually attacked, just like you do see violence around Bethabara. Fort Dobbs is actually attacked by the Cherokee. They're passing through 1757, probably 1758 as allies. But suddenly in the spring of 1759, Fort Dobbs is on the leading edge of this war zone that is the Catawba and Yadkin River Valley. There are settlers not far from Fort Dobbs, within miles of it, that are killed in the spring of 1759 by Cherokee. In February of 1760, I should back up. So North Carolina's government doesn't have a lot of resources in this time period. They don't have the money for big military forces, for all this sort of thing. In 1759, in response to the Cherokee attacks that spring, Governor Littleton of South Carolina, who really is the leader in diplomacy with the Cherokee, he wants to put them in their place. He marches an army from Charleston towards the lower Cherokee towns around where upstate South Carolina is, like Clemson, that sort of area. He's actually met by Cherokee leaders who come to speak with him about all of this. He takes these guys hostage. He holds them at a place called Fort Prince George, which is underwater today, but again, near Clemson. It's under a man-made lake. But while Littleton's expedition is going on, North Carolina tries to help. In fact, Hugh Waddell, who by that point is a major, he raises his own soldiers and however many of the militia he can get from the countryside to go help the South Carolinians. He expects hundreds of North Carolina militia to go with him. They don't think legally they can leave the colony. He gets like 80 guys. But he still marches well into what is now South Carolina before he realizes that Littleton has made a peace with the Cherokee, and Waddell goes back to Fort Dobbs. But once he returns to Fort Dobbs, North Carolina's government can't keep funding the full-time soldiers that he does have, so some of the provincials are sent home, not to mention the militia themselves. And by the end of February 1760, Waddell, the colonel of every North Carolina soldier, is at Fort Dobbs with 30 men. It's actually Captain Bailey's company, that same Andrew Bailey, but Waddell is there kind of over the entire defense. 30 guys are there. All they can do is defend that spot, that hilltop. But by the end of February, we see an increase in Cherokee attacks all of a sudden across the countryside. Now, this is because where those Cherokee hostages were being held in South Carolina at Fort Prince George, those men had been murdered by their guards in early February. The word goes out to the affected Cherokee towns, and beyond just the towns that have lost their own headmen, it's an all-out war. It had been sort of a disagreement in 1759 that cost lives on both sides. Now it is a war. And so we see attacks across the frontier within weeks from modern-day Georgia all the way up to the Virginia line. Fort Dobbs and Bethabara are in the middle, like I said, of this active war zone. Waddell, I said earlier that we don't have all the daily paperwork we would like from Fort Dobbs. We are extremely lucky that one of the key pieces of information that we do have is a letter written by Waddell on February 29th. It was a leap year in 1760, describing a battle that had occurred there just 2 days earlier. And he talks about how for several days the Cherokee had been in the area of Fort Dobbs. He could see them from the fort. And he's aggressive. He had fought next to the Cherokee up in Pennsylvania. He knew their tactics. And he knows, his choice is to either sit cooped up in the fort or do what he can to bring violence against his enemy. So he sends out groups of soldiers, even though he only has 30 men. But the Cherokee always slip away. He can never catch up with them. He's getting frustrated. On the evening of February 27th, he says between 8 and 9 o'clock at night, the dogs of the people at the fort, and that's the soldiers, but also an unknown number of civilian families are sheltering there, much as Bethabara is taking in refugees. Fort Dobbs is doing the same thing. But the dogs of these people begin barking. And Waddell suspects that, like over the days before, it's Cherokee who are getting too close. So he leads a patrol of just 9 men, but that's a third of his soldiers. He and Captain Bailey and 8 other men leave Fort Dobbs. They go into the night across the hillside from the fort. They go below the ridge that the fort is on. They think the Cherokee are near a water spring. And Waddell wants to get at them. He wants to get them away. He runs into 60 to 70 Cherokee who fire. Now, Waddell, it's dark, so he's lucky. and he's very lucky. If we know some of his soldiers had been in Pennsylvania with him, some of these guys are combat veterans. They are not marching shoulder to shoulder to the beat of a drum. They're probably fighting more in what the English will refer to as an Indian manner. They're probably in a scattered line. They're ready as soon as somebody shoots to drop on the ground. So the Cherokee do fire, but they miss most of his men. In his account, it's really cool to have something in someone's own words. He says, my men behaved very well. They held their fire till I gave the word. which I did when the enemy were not 12 steps distant, for they were charging as if to tomahawk us. So the Cherokee fire, they rush. Waddell has his men fire right into their faces. They're 12 steps apart. He's had every one of his soldiers load a bullet, but also 7 small buckshot in their muskets. And he said the Cherokee were a great deal surprised to find the fire so hot from so small a party of men, because they put a bunch of lead in front of them. They break that charge. They preserve themselves. But at the same moment, he realized that the fort itself, actually, he was almost 300 yards away from the safety of the building. Other Cherokee were attacking the fort. Now, later in his letter, he's writing to the governor, he says that this was probably a scheme on the part of the Cherokee to draw out some of the garrison. So it's a trap that, despite his experience, he has fallen into. But again, he's got no choice. He's been having to be aggressive. Just because he is lucky, he and most of his men get back to the fort before they are cut off and completely all killed. And we think after that it's a very short affair. Once the soldiers are in, we didn't really talk about what Fort Dobbs looked like. It was a 3-story high timber blockhouse. The ground floor logs were 16 inches thick. You can't get a bullet through it. You can't set it on fire easily. So the Cherokee don't have a way to destroy the fort. Once the soldiers are inside, there's nothing else they can do. They leave. There's a lot of fighting in that immediate area. There's fighting that continues in this part of the Yadkin Valley. But that night, February 27th, 1760, is the one time we know Fort Dobbs is attacked. And Waddell says that from what he saw, his men had hit 10 or 12 Cherokee. But the next day, when he inspects the battlefield, he says while he found a great deal of blood, he only came across the body of one warrior. Now, he noted that several of the fort's horses had been taken, and he specifically thinks the other Cherokee have used the animals to carry away the bodies of their uncles, their fathers, their sons. They don't want to leave their family members behind. They pick up anyone they can find in the dark, and they withdraw. We know on the fort side, 2 of Waddell's men are wounded. One of those men outside the fort with him is scalped. He does die a few days later. And we know, again, we don't know how many civilians are there, but a boy is actually killed a short distance outside of the fort. So that was the battle that did happen there.
Well, thank you for taking me through it.
Yeah.
And how fabulous to be able to have a primary source account of that. I mean, like, how lucky. Can you talk a little bit about the intricacies of using a primary source like that? How can we weigh out the complexities of perhaps someone's bias in how they want to record an event?
Yeah, well, you always have to consider people's biases and perspectives as a historian. It is frustrating for us, touching on how few primary sources we have in some regards to Fort Dobbs, but especially to have, this narrative almost. He's writing in stream of consciousness, what happened to him just 2 days before. But just like when police officers interview people today after a crime, every person's perspective of an event is going to be different. Now, I'm sure we can trust Waddell's, sharing his version of events as he experienced them. Although, even then, he is writing to the governor of North Carolina, what parts of that account, there doesn't seem to be anything that's super grandiose. I don't think he's puffing his chest up and trying to play up his role terribly, considering what type of officer we know that he was. But he may have a different perspective on his own actions than what the reality actually was. Just the number of Cherokee, he estimates that his party were attacked by as many as 70 men. Now, that may be the case, but he's in the dark, hundreds of yards away from the fort, when all of a sudden, out of this cold February night, you have a volley of musket fire and a screaming charge of enemy warriors. Does it seem like there are 70 men? Or are there really 70 men? Either way, he's probably outnumbered. But yeah, but as a historian, you have to question, is that specific number accurate? So yeah, who is the audience that he's writing for? In this case, the governor, and he knows it's probably going to be shared with the men in the assembly of the colony. Is he writing for their benefit to an extent? And then also, how much is just his experience of this nighttime, terrifying event where his adrenaline is pumping? 2 days later, this is what he thinks of it. Is that what really happened? We don't know. Interestingly, we do have, Waddell's is the only first-hand account of the battle, but just a couple weeks later, there is an account of it published in the South Carolina Gazette that supposedly is based on correspondence. They don't say from who. Their account is similar in broad strokes to what Waddell says, but they specify that Waddell's gun, probably a short musket, a fusil that he's carrying, was shattered in his hand by a bullet. Waddell doesn't say that in his part of a letter that we have to the governor. Where did these South Carolina people get that? Did they make that up to make it a better story? Or did somebody else who really saw it write and Waddell just didn't think about it? So yeah, I think it's a good illustration of, if you're studying history and primary sources, you got to try and triangulate the truth, find as many sources as you can, find their commonalities, but be willing to filter out the stuff that might be chaff. So
that's part of what I love so much about this world of studying history and diving into primary sources, is that when you find different primary sources that differentiate slightly, then that gives you a piece of human connection. The piece that can tell you perhaps less about the actual event that happened and more about this person.
Yeah, their personality and their motivations. Yeah.
Exactly, which serves as the human connection I feel like we sometimes need in history, cutting through dates and statistics.
Sure. Well, I mean, in the Moravian records themselves, there's, they're often written, the official church records are, they're trying to be written with a fairly neutral voice, but you guys know there's lots of stuff that you can read between the lines on, and
Absolutely. And even for us, because it's written in German, how it's been translated,
right,
and what people find important, or if the translation's correct.
As Germans, they're writing Bailey as Bagley. So
yes.
How do you then go from that German to an English translation that's totally accurate? Right. Exactly.
Absolutely. So before, you were mentioning that there was refugees at Fort Dobbs, and part of the conflict of these eras' impact on Bethabara, other than just the construction of the palisade, a huge part was the influx of what they call strangers, or essentially non-Moravians, as refugees existing within their community. This time for them included outbreak of disease and overcrowding, which then also forged deeper relationships between Bethabara and their non-Moravian neighbors, and that resulted in the formation of the first half Moravian and half stranger community out of that. But did Fort Dobbs experience an impact of life perhaps by the refugees being there, if you know?
Well, we don't know. Again.
Yeah.
But probably. I mean, again, we know that civilians are at the fort when it's being attacked. We don't know how many. We know the spring before, in 1759, actually, there were no soldiers at the fort when the Cherokee attacks began. And we know that we have oral history from the region, again, for what that source is worth, that talks about civilians kind of taking over the fort on their own. So there's certainly times when refugees are going to Fort Dobbs, but we don't know about any of it in the level of detail that we see here at Bethabara. Now, I would venture that more people in general are making it to Bethabara, an actual town, than are going to Fort Dobbs. I think the people that show up at Fort Dobbs at times of violence are the people who live immediately nearby. But we also know that a number of civilians in the region kind of east of Fort Dobbs, between there and the Yadkin River, some people fortify their homes, and there are places of refuge, maybe just for their family and the couple neighbors nearby. So it's not everyone coming to Bethabara, it's not everyone going to Fort Dobbs. You have probably lots of nodes of resistance, of places of refuge that are forming as the need arises. But what their life is like, whoever shows up to Fort Dobbs as a refugee, what their life is like, we just don't know. We do know the fort, it was designed to house 50 soldiers. If we look at February of 1760, there are 30 soldiers there. They've got some space. And even then, you could probably cram people inside just to escape gunfire. But you get beyond around 50 or 60 people, it might be a crowded place to live.
Ultimately, what became of Fort Dobbs after the war?
Well, when the War with the Cherokee ends in December of 1761, and we should touch on why that happens. By the time of the Cherokee War, which neither the Cherokee or the British have planned to fight each other, but the timing of it, as it works out, is incredibly bad for the Cherokee because the French are losing big time. The invasion of Canada, of Quebec, has started in 1759. It is finalized in 1760. And the French, who don't have many big posts in the South in general, they absolutely can't help the Cherokee, even if they make promises to give them gunpowder or stuff like that. They can't follow through on it. At the same time, professional British Army soldiers can be sent from the more northern theater of the war down to the Carolinas. And in the summer of 1760, and again in 1761, we see multiple armies invade the Cherokee homeland in the North Carolina mountains. We see redcoats and South Carolinians and allies like the Catawba come up from South Carolina and invade. In 1761, we talked about 400 North Carolinians passing through Fort Dobbs. They're on their way to Virginia, where they meet almost 1,000 Virginia soldiers. They have other allies like Tuscarora with them from the coast. And this other army moves towards the Cherokee towns in what is now Tennessee, on the other side of the mountains. And, these armies are catching the entire Cherokee population in the jaws of a giant vice. The forces from South Carolina, between the 2 years, they burn 23 Cherokee towns. They destroy the houses, the homes of half their people, 5,000 people. A South Carolina officer named Francis Marion, who becomes famous in the next war, he talks about using swords to cut down 1,500 acres of corn. So it's a war of total destruction. And the object of it is to bring the Cherokee to their knees. And it works. They kind of have to agree to basically anything the Carolinas want. And the biggest result of this war that neither side sought was that all the Cherokees' hunting territory outside of the mountains, east of the mountains, is basically forfeit. South Carolina moves all the way up to where the North Carolina and South Carolina meet now. North Carolina's frontier, officially, there are, again, people living beyond the Catawba when the war starts, but now you can go as far as the mountains. So with the frontier effectively 70 miles west of Fort Dobbs and with no violence in the region, North Carolina's cash-strapped government doesn't want to maintain that place. It costs money. And so they close Fort Dobbs. Now, they keep supplies there for a little while. There's no soldiers there after 1761. I think it's in 1762 that we see that lead sent out here to Bethabara by the caretaker, Walter Lindsay, a former officer. In early 1764, the government says, you know what? The big world war is over. Pontiac's war up north isn't really going to affect us. We're going to close it entirely. And they ship all the other supplies away, and the building is left there to rot. Governor Tryon, our next governor, who visits Bethabara several times. In 1766, during one of those tours out here, he stops at Fort Dobbs. The building was 10 years old, but it had been abandoned for a couple years already. He says it was a ruin that couldn't be defended again. So it falls apart very quickly. We know local people, again, by oral history accounts, but it's borne out on the ground. People recycle building pieces, just like when a lot of the old buildings at Bethabara here go into ruin by the early 1800s. A lot of that stuff gets reused. Eventually, it just becomes a farmer's field, and for most of the 1800s, that's all it is. It's a field by the side of the road. Local people always knew where the fort was, but it wasn't until 1909 that the Statesville area chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution took it on themselves to start preserving the site. In the 1960s, they worked with the state of North Carolina to get archaeology done out there. And in total, we've had about a dozen archaeological digs, but a lot of the biggest ones were back in the 60s and 70s. And they uncovered, there was nothing of the wooden fort, but they uncovered things like the cellar that was under the fort, just like the cellars we see here at Bethabara, a ditch that had been built around it, kind of like Bethabara's palisade wall left a footprint. And those were enough clues for us to know where the building stood. Actually, one of the first archaeologists there, another connection, a more modern connection between our sites, was Stanley South, sort of the father of North Carolina archaeology in a lot of ways. He worked at Fort Dobbs after some of his big digs here at Bethabara, and we've recovered about 6,000 artifacts in those digs.
What do you believe was perhaps the grander impact of this period of various conflicts going on the upcoming decades of the colonies and then into America, and especially in North Carolina, on the politics, on perhaps the indigenous relations?
I mean, it's all incredibly influential. Every period of history influences what comes after. History isn't a bunch of boxes. It's not chapters in your history book that are cut off between each other. And the French and Indian War and the Anglo-Cherokee War have, far-reaching impacts that still affect us today. I mean, today in the United States, we are starting our commemoration of the 250th anniversary of the American War for Independence, the American Revolution. Why do American colonists, some of them, choose to create a new country? A lot of the grievances that people have with Great Britain are coming out of results of the French and Indian War. In 1763, when the general peace is announced, the average British colonist in America is incredibly proud to be part of the British Empire, this empire that has triumphed around the entire world. There are celebrations, there are fireworks in Wilmington. The French have been kicked out of North America. It's great. We've taken over all of this territory from these indigenous peoples, like the Cherokee, that are being fought in the war. And that means these colonies can expand westward, which is what a lot of them wanted. That's why the war started, really. But the cost of that war and the cost of not just fighting the war itself, but then setting up new British Army garrisons on the frontier, of maintaining soldiers, of building forts to protect the new frontier of these colonies, to manage relations with these native people, many of whom had been enemies, and now they have to figure out a new alliance. That costs money. It costs the British government money. And it benefits the colonies. But, to help pay for that, we see Parliament, through different administrations, try to recoup some of that cost by putting various taxes and tariffs on goods being imported to the American colonies. But a lot of the way that is done in a way that infringes on the rights of the average colonist as a British citizen. As a British citizen, even in England at the time, most people can't vote. But you're technically represented in Parliament. There are people from your area that the wealthy people in your area are electing that supposedly serve your interests, who can vote yes or no on stuff. There is no one from North Carolina sitting in Parliament in London. There is no one from America, if there is such a thing, sitting in Parliament in London. There are taxes that people pay in North Carolina. You'll pay taxes in colonial Rowan County. You'll pay taxes that go to the colonial government to fund things like provincial soldiers who had been at Fort Dobbs. But there are elections in North Carolina. They have that British system of government. But it's suddenly being told from 4,000 miles away across the ocean what you should do. That infringes on their British rights. And that leads to a decade of off and on protest. And those protests, especially in powder kegs like the city of Boston, become violent. Military pressure is put on there is no police force. So we see the British military brought in to enforce order in Boston in particular. That makes the situation worse. Violence gets bigger, it gets bloody, and it becomes an all-out war just 12 years after the French and Indian War had ended. So that's, nationally, our nation would not exist as it was created anyway without the French and Indian War. All the reasons for the revolution are because of the French and Indian War and its after effects. One of the main reasons the United States is successful in our almost 9-year-long war for independence is that we get the help of the French. The French are doing that because they have just lost this global war to England, and this is a great way to hurt Great Britain by helping these rebels break away from Great Britain. That's the reason they do it. It's not some kind of altruism. They're not like, hey, they're defying their king. This will work out great. They want to hurt Great Britain. And then, it influences how our then state governments are set up. They're looking at what worked well in the French and Indian War and colonial period, continuing a lot of those traditions, but then making their own constitutions and laws that we still live under today. For the indigenous people, it is incredibly influential. You look at the Cherokee, who have lost a huge amount of territory, probably thousands of their people, if you take into account famine and disease brought from the war. It irrevocably affects their culture. And it influences all the future land grabs and wars that come afterwards. It was all successful in the French and Indian War. There's no reason for Europeans, now Americans, to stop doing that in the future. So,
thank you for adding just a greater context to this, because I do think that how we are currently perhaps taught or popularly taught to discuss history is so insular and perhaps loses the greater narrative, especially about perhaps underrepresented conflicts like the French and Indian War. So thank you.
Definitely.
And I only have one last question for you. Where can we learn more and follow along with all the exciting things happening at Fort Dobbs?
We have a Facebook page. We're on Instagram. We have a YouTube channel if anybody wants to see videos. FortDobbs.org is our primary website. We are open throughout the year except major holidays, Tuesday through Saturday. We do guided tours of the fort itself several times a day, but also several times a year we do living history events, reenactments. We don't really pretend to shoot at each other on a ground where that actually happened, but we do, some of the events will look at soldier life. We do weapons firing demonstrations. For some programs, we are joined by enrolled members of the the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, or we've had people from the Shawnee Nation out here to talk about their people's perspective on the war. But during our living history events, much like you guys do here at Bethabara, we'll kind of just talk everyday life. You can see people cooking and blacksmithing and that sort of stuff. But the main thing is to see the recreated fort itself. We talked about how the fort was gone by the early 1800s. we were able to use the archaeology to finally get enough money together to create a full-scale replica of it, which we opened just in 2019. So yeah, go to fortdobbs.org, find us on social media, come out and visit, and learn about North Carolina's frontier and the French and Indian War.
Excellent. Thank you so much for joining me today, Scott. It was lovely speaking to you.
My pleasure.
Historic Bethabara Park is both a National Historic District and a public city park. Park grounds are open year-round from dawn till dusk. Guided tours are available during Visitor Center open hours. Moravian Mornings is a production of Historic Bethabara Park. If you have any questions, comments, or ideas for future episodes, shoot the Moravian Mornings team an email at historicbethabarapark@gmail.com. For open hours, information about our events, programs, exhibits, and resources about the Moravians in North Carolina, visit our website at historicbethabarapark.org and follow us on Facebook and Instagram. Come visit the birthplace of Winston-Salem in person at 2147 Bethabara Road, Winston-Salem, North Carolina, 27106.